TV series showed a charismatic man, a visionary king, a devoted father. But the truth about Ragnar Lothbrok is far more disturbing. The real Ragnar wasn't just a warrior. He was a calculating obsessive who transformed terror into strategy, who sacrificed men, allies, and even children on the altars of ambition, and who died alone in a pit of snakes because he knew his death would be worth more than his life. The Norse sagas and Christian chronicles agree on a single point. No name caused more dread in 9th century Europe than his. Ragnar Lothbrok was not born a king. He inherited no throne. He had no army of royal blood. What he had was something far more dangerous. A mind that saw weaknesses where others saw fortresses, and a coldness capable of turning every defeat into propaganda, every massacre into legend. While other Vikings raided coastal villages for silver and slaves, Ragnar targeted cathedrals, capitals, symbols. He didn't just want wealth. He wanted his name to be whispered in the nightmares of Christian kings for generations. Paris, 845 AD. A fleet of 120 dragon ships ascends the Seine River like a serpent of wood and iron. On the decks, thousands of Norse warriors await orders from a lean man with cold, clear eyes who studies the walls of Western Europe's most powerful city the way a wolf studies wounded prey. This man does not scream. He does not beat his shield. He simply watches and smiles because he already knows that Paris will fall, not by force, but by fear. This is the Ragnar that the Frankish chronicles called the Scourge of God, the Ragnar whom rival Vikings feared more than storms, the Ragnar whom his own sons would transform into myth and curse, the son of an obscure jarl from Denmark or Norway. Sources diverge because Ragnar's very origin is shrouded in mist and manipulation. He grew up in an era when Scandinavia was fragmented, tribal, violent. There were no Viking kings, only warlords competing for land, cattle, and honor. And in a world like that, you either became a legend or you vanished into oblivion. Ragnar chose legend, but the price of that choice was paid in blood, his own, his enemies, and everyone around him. This is the story of how an ordinary man transformed into the most feared Viking in history, and how he understood before anyone else that true power lies not in how much you conquer, but in how much terror you leave behind. The Norse sagas say Ragnar was born the son of Sigurd Ring, a legendary king of Sweden and Denmark. The Frankish chronicles never confirmed this. The probable truth is harsher. Ragnar was the son of a minor jarl, perhaps from Denmark, perhaps Norway, in a time when those territories were just vague names for a mosaic of warrior clans who hated each other as much as they hated the Christians of the south. There were no crowns, no palaces, only dark, smoky wooden halls where men drank mead and told stories of glorious deaths while the freezing wind of the North Sea swept the rocky coasts. Ragnar grew up listening to these stories, listening to the skalds, the Viking poets sing of heroes who died in battle and were taken by the Valkyries to Valhalla, Odin's hall of the glorious dead, of warriors whose names echoed for generations, of men who became legends. And from childhood, Ragnar understood one thing that most Vikings ignored. Immortality does not come from how long you live. It comes from how much terror and awe you leave carved into the memories of others. He was slight, lean, not the strongest warrior in the clan. The sons of other jarls were bigger, faster, better with axe and shield. But Ragnar compensated with something few possessed: patience, observation, the capacity to wait. While other boys injured themselves in practice duels, Ragnar stayed on the sidelines studying, memorizing movements, looking for patterns, learning not just how to win, but how to make the enemy defeat himself. His father, whoever he was, died early, perhaps in battle, perhaps betrayed, perhaps drowned in one of the storms that devour entire ships in the Scandinavian winter, and Ragnar was left alone. No clear inheritance, no army army, no gold ring on his arm to prove his worth. In a world where everything was measured by lineage, cattle, and swords, Ragnar had only his own mind and rage, a cold, calculated rage that he learned to hide behind smiles and the right words. He married young to Lagertha, a warrior woman, according to the sagas, a shield maiden who fought like a man and commanded respect by the force of the axe. Her story is wrapped in legend, but one thing is certain. Ragnar chose a woman who didn't need protection, a woman who could be an ally, not just a wife. Because Ragnar never did anything for love. He did it for strategy. Every marriage, every alliance, every child was a piece in a larger game. It was with Lagertha that Ragnar began to build his first crew. Not the best warriors, those already had rich jarls to serve. Ragnar recruited the hungry, the desperate, those with nothing to lose, men other chieftains discarded. He promised them something simple: wealth, glory, and a place in the sagas. And he delivered. Because Ragnar had a rare gift among Vikings, he knew exactly when to attack, where to attack, and how to turn every victory into propaganda. While other jarls attacked poor coastal villages in England, Ragnar targeted monasteries, Lindisfarne, Iona, holy places, wealthy places, places that, when destroyed, made Christian kings tremble. He understood something that would take other Vikings decades to learn. Terror is worth more than gold. A well-executed massacre in a symbolic place spreads fear across an entire region, and fear paralyzes armies, breaks alliances, and makes kings pay tribute without a fight. Ragnar's first great move was the attack on a monastery in northern England, perhaps Lindisfarne, perhaps another. Sources differ, but the method was always the same. Arrive at dawn in silence, before the monks could ring the alarm bells. Throat slit those who resisted, spare only those with value as hostages or informants. Loot everything: gold, chalices, relics, illuminated manuscripts that Ragnar sold back to the Christians for absurd prices, and leave before any army could react. He never stayed, never tried to occupy territory. That was an amateur's mistake. Ragnar understood that Viking power lay in mobility, in the fact that no one knew where they would strike next. While Christian kings mobilized armies to defend a coast, Ragnar was already 300 kilometers away, sailing up a river, burning another city. And with every successful raid, more men joined him. More minor jarls offered alliances. More skalds sang his name. Ragnar Lothbrok, Hairy Breeches, a nickname the sagas explain in contradictory ways, but which likely came from some improvised armor or peculiar clothing he wore. The name was ridiculous, but Ragnar turned that into an advantage, because a ridiculous name that everyone knows is more powerful than a pompous name no one remembers. By age 30, Ragnar was no longer just another Viking jarl. He was the jarl whom Christian kings paid not to attack, the jarl whose name made English peasants pray before sleep, the jarl whom other Vikings envied and feared at the same time. But Ragnar knew that the envy and fear of allies are dangerous, so he did something unexpected. He began to share the glory. He let other chieftains lead smaller raids under his command. He divided spoils generously, but always maintained control over strategic decisions. He turned rivals into subordinates without them realizing it. And then came the vision that would change everything. Paris, the greatest city in Western Europe, capital of the Carolingian Empire, protected by walls, armies, and the blessing of the Christian God. Impossible to conquer, they said. Ragnar looked at Paris and saw something different. He saw the greatest propaganda victory in Viking history. Because if he could get into Paris, even if he didn't keep it, even if he didn't destroy it completely, his name would echo for centuries. Kings would tremble. Vikings would follow him to the end of the world, and Ragnar Lothbrok would cease to be a man. He would become a myth. But Paris would not just be a battle, it would be a test of everything Ragnar had learned about strategy, terror, manipulation, and timing. And he knew the that if he failed, he would die, not just physically, but in memory. And for Ragnar, dying forgotten was worse than any torture. Ragnar didn't have the largest fleet. He didn't have the largest army, but he had something no other Viking of the time possessed: the ability to turn geography into a weapon. While other jarls thought in terms of coastlines, where to dock, where to loot, where to flee, Ragnar began to think in terms of rivers. Rivers that cut through entire kingdoms, rivers that led straight to the heart of empires, rivers that Christian kings never imagined could be used as invasion highways. Viking dragon ships were masterpieces of naval engineering: shallow hulls, flexible keels, capable of sailing both in open seas and the shallow waters of rivers. They could be rowed or sailed. They could be carried over land for short stretches. And Ragnar understood that these features weren't just tactical advantages. They were the key to redefining war. While Christian armies marched along roads, slow, visible, predictable, Ragnar's Vikings glided down rivers, invisible until the last moment, attacking cities that never expected to see warships. Ragnar's axe, the sagas say, was a simple weapon. No pompous name, no magic runes engraved, just well-forged steel, an oak handle, a blade sharp enough to cut flesh and bone with a single blow. Ragnar didn't believe in magic weapons. He believed in maintenance, in training, in knowing exactly where and when to apply force. His shield was round, painted with concentric circles, which, according to some accounts, he used to confuse enemies in combat, making circular motions that hypnotized the eye before the fatal strike. But Ragnar's true weapon was never the axe. It was reputation. Every city he attacked, every monastery he burned, every king who paid tribute fed a larger narrative. Ragnar Lothbrok was inevitable. It was no use praying. It was no use fortifying. It was no use gathering armies. If Ragnar decided to attack, he would attack, and the only choice was to pay him to leave or watch everything burn. Between 840 and 845 AD, Ragnar coordinated a series of devastating attacks across England, Scotland, and France. They weren't random raids, they were campaigns. He divided his fleets into smaller groups, attacking multiple targets simultaneously, forcing kings to disperse their forces. When a Christian army finally mobilized to face him, Ragnar had already retreated, regrouped, and was attacking elsewhere. He transformed Viking warfare from opportunistic pillaging into a strategy of exhaustion. It was during this time that Ragnar began using hostages brilliantly. He didn't kill them immediately. He kept bishops, nobles, kings' sons alive, but sent fingers, ears, locks of hair to the families, proved they were alive, and demanded ransom. Christian kings paid fortunes, but Ragnar frequently returned the hostages mutilated, blind, tongueless, alive, but destroyed, because he knew a mutilated noble spread more fear than a dead noble. A dead man becomes a martyr. A mutilated man becomes a walking warning. He also began to infiltrate informants into Christian courts. Scandinavian merchants who spoke Latin, who converted to Christianity only on the surface, who frequented markets and taverns listening for where the gold was, where armies were mobilized, which kings were fighting amongst themselves. Ragnar built an intelligence network before that concept formally existed in medieval Europe, and this gave him an absurd advantage. While Christian kings discovered Viking attacks only when the ships appeared on the horizon, Ragnar knew weeks in advance where the next opportunity would be. But Ragnar also had weaknesses, and the greatest was his own ambition. He was never satisfied. Every victory only increased the hunger for a greater victory. Every tribute received only made him aim for a larger tribute, and this began to bother other jarls, men like Horik, king of Denmark, who saw Ragnar as a threat, because if Ragnar continued accumulating glory, wealth, and followers, he would soon be too powerful to control. Horik tried to kill Ragnar. The sagas tell different versions: betrayal in battle, ambush at a feast, assassins sent in the night, but Ragnar survived, and his response was calculated, brutal, and pedagogical. He didn't kill Horik immediately. First, he destroyed Horik's allies, burned halls, sank ships, killed sons, and only then, when Horik was isolated, ruined, desperate, did Ragnar appear in person and offered peace in exchange for public submission. Horik, humiliated, accepted, and Ragnar, with a cold smile, let him live, because a defeated and submissive king was worth more as propaganda than a dead king. It was after this that Ragnar began to gather the fleet for Paris. Not just his men, he summoned jarls from all over Scandinavia, offered a share of the spoils, promised eternal glory, and above all, painted Paris not as a city, but as a challenge, as the final test, as proof that Vikings were not just coastal village raiders, but conquerors capable of bending empires. 120 ships, perhaps 5,000 warriors. Frankish sources exaggerate. They speak of tens of thousands. But the probable truth is that Ragnar led the largest Viking force ever assembled up to that moment. Not because he paid, not because he forced, but because he created an irresistible narrative. Come with me, and your name will be sung forever. Stay home and die forgotten. In the spring of 845, the fleet went up the Seine. Red and black ships, prows carved in the shape of dragons and serpents, oars beating the water in sync like a giant heartbeat. On the banks, French peasants dropped their tools and ran. Monks rang alarm bells. Messengers galloped to Paris to warn King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, heir to the greatest Christian empire in the West. And Ragnar, standing on the prow of the lead ship, watched it all with that cold smile that men who fought beside him had learned to fear as much as enemies did. Because that smile meant Ragnar had already won. The rest was just theater, and Ragnar Lothbrok was the greatest actor of war medieval Europe had ever seen. Paris, March 845 AD. Western Europe's largest city wakes up to nightmare news. 120 Viking ships are ascending the Seine. It is not a raid. It is not opportunistic looting. It is an invasion. And in command is a man whose name has already made kings pay tribute without a fight. Ragnar Lothbrok has arrived, and he didn't come to negotiate. Charles the Bald, king of the West Franks, grandson of Charlemagne, is in a panic. Paris has walls, it has soldiers, it has the protection of God, or should have. But Charles knows what Ragnar did in other cities. He knows that walls don't stop Vikings who think like Ragnar thinks. He convenes a war council. Bishops pray. Generals propose desperate strategies. Block the river with chains, burn bridges, gather all Frankish forces at a single point of defense. But no one is sure of anything, because no one has ever faced anything like this. Ragnar does not attack immediately. That would be an amateur's mistake. He anchors the fleet far enough from Paris to avoid arrows, close enough for the city to see the ships, and waits 3 days, 4, 5. Lets the fear grow. Lets the defenders exhaust their adrenaline. Lets peasants panic, abandon farms, flood the city. Paris begins to get overpopulated. Without enough food, without clean water, diseases begin to spread. And Ragnar just watches, because he knows time is a weapon and patience kills as much as steel. While he waits, Ragnar sends small groups of warriors to terrorize surrounding villages, not to loot, to create refugees. Thousands of panicked peasants flee to Paris, and the city, already tense, is now on the verge of collapse. Rationed food, exhausted soldiers, rumors of betrayal. Ragnar is making Paris destroy itself from the inside out before even attacking. Finally, Ragnar moves, but not against Paris, against a nearby abbey, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, on the other side of the river, a wealthy church full of gold, relics, defenseless monks. Ragnar attacks it at dawn. Viking warriors scale walls, break down gates, slit monks' throats on their own altars. The massacre lasts less than an hour. Ragnar loads the gold, burns the church, and returns to the fleet. And from Paris, defenders watch, powerless, as black smoke rises from the other side of the Seine. The message is clear. Paris cannot protect even what is right and next door. How will it protect itself? Charles the Bald is desperate. He sends emissaries to Ragnar, offers gold. Ragnar refuses, offers more gold. Ragnar continues to refuse, because Ragnar doesn't want just gold. He wants something bigger. He wants Charles to beg. He wants Charlemagne's grandson, the emperor who unified half a continent, to kneel before a Viking. And finally, after days of humiliating negotiation, Charles caves. He offers 7,000 pounds of gold and silver, an absurd fortune, equivalent to years of taxes from the entire kingdom, for Ragnar to leave. Ragnar accepts, but with a condition. He wants to enter Paris, not to loot, just to enter, to prove he can. Charles, defeated, agrees. And on Easter Sunday, 845, Ragnar Lothbrok and part of his fleet enter Paris. There is no battle, there is no blood, just Vikings walking through the streets of Western Europe's greatest Christian city, while French citizens watch, terrified, in silence. Ragnar walks to the cathedral, enters, observes the frescoes, the stained glass, the gilded altars, and then does something unexpected. He destroys nothing, doesn't burn, doesn't loot, just stands there in silence, looking at the giant crucifix on the main altar. Some historians suggest Ragnar was fascinated by Christianity, not as a faith, but as a tool of power. How could a religion unite so many kingdoms, so many peoples under a single god? How did bishops without armies have more influence than kings with thousands of soldiers? But what Ragnar was really doing was something much more calculated. He was creating a moment that skalds would sing of for generations. The moment Ragnar Lothbrok entered Paris without a fight, walked to the heart of Christian power, and left unharmed, loaded with gold, while the king of the Franks watched, powerless. This wasn't a military victory. It was a symbolic victory, and it was worth more than any battle. Ragnar loads the gold and leaves. But before leaving the Seine, he makes one last show of power. He captures 111 Frankish prisoners, soldiers, nobles, merchants, and hangs them on islands visible from Paris, not for revenge, not for anger, but as a warning, as a reminder, as a guarantee that no one would ever forget his name. The Frankish chronicles record that after the massacre, a plague devastated Ragnar's fleet. Many warriors died sick on the way back to Scandinavia. Christian monks interpreted this as divine punishment, but Ragnar survived, and even those who died were transformed into legend, men who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok in the greatest Viking conquest in history. From that moment on, Ragnar was no longer just a powerful jarl. He was the standard, the model, the proof that Vikings could conquer empires. In the following years, dozens of other Viking leaders tried to replicate Ragnar's attack on Paris. Some succeeded, many failed, but they all invoked Ragnar's name as inspiration. He had done something no amount of gold could buy. He had transformed Vikings from pirates into conquerors in the European imagination. But Ragnar had also made enemies. Christian kings began to organize. Alliances were formed. Fortifications were erected specifically to stop river attacks. The Ragnar method began to have countermeasures, and Ragnar, always restless, always hungry for more, began to look at new targets. England, Northumbria, Saxon kingdoms that still resisted Viking domination. Ragnar began to plan something even bigger than Paris. Not just a raid, not just tribute, but permanent conquest, colonization, turning parts of England into Viking territory. His ambitions had grown beyond any rational limit, and it was this immeasurable ambition that eventually would lead to his own destruction. But at that moment, in 845, returning from Paris with ships loaded with gold, surrounded by warriors who worshipped him as a demigod, Ragnar Lothbrok was at his peak. He had conquered the impossible. He had bent an empire. He had proved that his name was more powerful than armies, and above all, he had secured something few mortals achieve: immortality. Because centuries after his death, French children would still hear the name Ragnar Lothbrok and feel a chill. Kings would still use his story as a warning, and Vikings would still invoke his spirit before every battle. Ragnar had beaten death, but life wasn't finished with him yet. Ragnar Lothbrok reportedly died alone in a pit full of poisonous snakes, thrown there by the Saxon king Aella. The sagas say this death was not a defeat, it was a strategy. Ragnar transformed his execution into the greatest propaganda of revenge in Viking history. After Paris, Ragnar became a prisoner of his own own fame. The gold ran out, the glory became routine. Other jarls imitated his methods. For a man obsessed with being a legend, this was intolerable. He needed a final act that would make him unforgettable. So he decided to invade England with only 2 ships, a suicide mission. His sons tried to stop him, but Ragnar was no longer fighting against kings. He was fighting against oblivion, and he believed a glorious death was worth more than a long, ordinary life. The expedition failed. Storm, shipwreck, capture. Aella, humiliated by Ragnar in the past, saw the chance to destroy the myth. They built a pit full of snakes and threw Ragnar inside. Saxon chronicles say he begged. The sagas say he sang, recounting his victories, until he said how the little piggies would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The piggies were his sons. Ragnar wasn't asking for salvation. He was summoning vengeance, and it came. In 865, Ragnar's sons led the great heathen army, the largest Viking invasion in history. Hundreds of ships or thousands of warriors. They captured Aella and, according to the sagas, executed the blood eagle upon him. Ragnar was avenged brutally, exactly as he wanted, because it was likely all planned. The suicide invasion, the capture, the public death. Martyrs create movements. Symbols move armies. Ragnar ensured his name would be a war cry for centuries. And it worked. Ragnar Lothbrok ceased to be a man and became an archetype. The warrior who challenged empires, the father whose sons conquered kingdoms. Behind the myth was a dark man, obsessed with fame, capable of sacrificing allies and even family. But that obsession brought something few achieved: cultural immortality. 1,000 years later, Ragnar continues to sell series, books, games. Historians still discuss whether he existed. This only proves his final triumph. Ragnar didn't want to be proven. He wanted to be remembered. If you want to keep descending into the shadows of Viking history, this is just the beginning. Subscribe, because Ragnar was only the first, and the monsters that came after him were even worse.